Hello, English C1000 students. What I wanted to do was to create a little video where we talk about the next step in terms of understanding rhetoric and argument. I have to let you know I've started to read the discussion board questions and I've really been impressed, right? A lot of students like to use the word persuade as part of their definition of rhetoric. But as of week 2, I'm going to still maintain my definition of rhetoric, and I'm still going to define rhetoric as words that are used to manipulate, deceive, and con people. And what we want to do in the next weeks, we want to ask the question, is there a difference between the ability to persuade and misleading someone, right? And that'll make class a lot of fun. What I want to do is add to the next step of understanding how rhetoric and argument work, because here are 3 things that rhetoric and argument always use. Because rhetoric and argument always use logos, pathos, and ethos. Now, some students are familiar with these terms, while other students, it may be the first time that they've heard these terms. But it's important as we understand how rhetoric works that we understand these 3 terms. So the first thing that rhetoric and argument always use is logos. And if you look at the word, it looks like logic, it sounds like logic, and in fact, logos is an appeal to logic. And if you think about it, if you're going to define rhetoric as the ability to persuade, well, it makes sense that I want to use logic, right? Sometimes students they think of logos as using facts or statistics, and that's where logos comes into play, right? So logos is the ability to use logic. Now, the second term is pathos, and pathos is an appeal to emotion. And I sometimes remind students the way to remember that pathos is emotion is to look at the P and think of the P as passionate, right? Because if you think about if someone who's using rhetoric is passionate, they're going to make an emotional connection to their audience, and the rhetoric's going to be much more powerful. And then if we want to define rhetoric as the ability to manipulate, deceive, and con people, then it makes sense that we would define that we'd want to use pathos. Now, ethos is the one that kind of tricks up students, but ethos is an appeal to character and authority. And sometimes students see the E and they think ethos is emotion. Ethos is not emotion. Pathos is the emotion. That's why I always remind students to think of the P as passion. But ethos is an appeal to character and authority. And sometimes students ask, well, what does that mean? Well, character and authority is credibility. So sometimes I ask my ground students, right, would you rather take an English class with me or an English class with an instructor from Harvard? Because if you think about an instructor from Harvard has great ethos, they have great character because they're teaching at one of the best universities in the nation. And it's interesting because when I ask students if they'd rather have me or a teacher at Harvard, they sometimes pick me because they think the ethos of someone who teaches at Harvard is someone who's arrogant or someone who's cocky, whereas I think the ethos of someone who teaches at Harvard is someone who's, an intellectual. But ethos is character or authority. You can also think of how ethos works maybe in advertisements. Advertisements are a form of rhetoric. But if you think about Nike uses the ethos, the character of Michael Jordan, who's considered to be the greatest basketball player of all time. And even in 2026, students still know who Michael Jordan is, right? Because he has the character and the ethos of being one of the greatest basketball players of all time, even though he hasn't played basketball in like 25 years. But and Nike basically exists because of the ethos of Michael Jordan, right? Once they created the Jordan sneakers, their shoe just took off and has been a very popular shoe brand even today. So I just want you to think about how rhetoric uses 3 things. It uses logos, which is an appeal to logic, pathos, which is an appeal to emotion, and ethos as appeal to character and authority. And afterwards, there's the discussion board question where you can kind of pick which one you think is the most important in terms of using rhetoric.